Hi everybody, welcome back to PCS 101. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 26th of July, where I wanted to talk about 3 more chapters in the textbook, and I also wanted to talk about our first upcoming speech. And you'll also notice in the notes below that I'm going to talk a little bit about the speech rating sheet that I'm going to be using for your first speech. And in terms of speech number 1, you have 5 minutes to give the class a review of either your life history, or perhaps you might want to focus on a particular time period or element. Or if you're not necessarily comfortable with self-disclosure, you might want to focus on education, which is the thing that we all share, whether it be your educational past or perhaps it could be your educational present and why you are a student in this particular course, or perhaps your goals for the future. And obviously, this autobiographical speech is, in part, a way for us to get to know one another a little bit better. But it's also a way to begin to incorporate some of the elements that we've talked about and will be talking about in terms of presenting a particular speech. And you'll see in the notes below that this upcoming Thursday, we will have our first quiz. And that is going to be 20 questions and open book, open notes. So the idea is that you don't have to memorize information, but I do want you to be familiar with the concepts that we are talking about. And hopefully this quiz will be more than just a way for you to show that you've been watching the class videos and that you have also been reading the textbook, but that these questions are things that you can consider when you are actually putting forth a speech. And that will be on chapters 1 through 3 and 7 through 8 for the most part. And what I ask is that you take the quiz and return it to me via PDF to my email. So you can upload the quiz into a Word document if you'd like, or a Google Doc. But I do ask that you send it to me via PDF because that's how my grading program works best. And that would be to my email at ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And in terms of the first speech, I had given the option of either presenting via Zoom or uploading it. Since only one person indicated an interest for performing the speech via Zoom, it will be basically an uploaded speech for everyone. So what I'm going to be doing is adding a folder onto our Moodle site, and then you can put your speech there. And you can see that in the notes below under speech 1, there are some directions from IT about what might be perhaps the best way to record your speech. They suggest via YouTube, and actually that's the vehicle that I use as well when I'm recording. And that ultimately, if you don't have a YouTube account, it's not difficult to start one. That said, you don't necessarily have to use YouTube. But what they suggest is you log on to studio@youtube.com. You click on the blue upload button on the dashboard. You drag and drop your MP4 file, or click the select files button to open a file picker window. And then on the details window, add a description of the video that's being uploaded. And when you click next, you'll be prompted to identify if the video is intended for children or not. And most users skip adding any particular elements. And then finally on the visibility tab, set the visibility to unlisted. Then you can click save. And then that's something that you can upload onto our Moodle site. But again, if you're having technological difficulties, please contact me or IT or both. And in terms of delivering the speech on a Moodle site, obviously you have the opportunity to redo the speech multiple times before you actually get to a version that you might be comfortable with for uploading. I encourage you not to do that too frequently. There is no such thing as the perfect speech. There really is no reason for you to be recording a speech 20 or 30 times. Certainly if you want to record it 2 or 3 times, that's fine, but you shouldn't be spending hours trying to record the perfect speech, nor should you be basically editing pieces of different speeches so that you get perfection. The whole point of this course is getting comfortable with being able to deliver a speech So you want to be comfortable enough so that you can deliver to the camera, which is basically your audience in this particular instance. So you want to think about what an audience would expect. Obviously, they want to focus on your face. And certainly you can make decisions as to whether or not you want to do a full body shot or you want to do a partial body shot the way I'm doing. You will need to make some decisions about lighting and about background, but of course you don't have professional equipment, so we wouldn't be expecting something of that nature. But what we do want to do is to be able to see your face and to be able to hear your voice so that we can examine some of the elements of public speaking that we've been discussing. So in terms of speech number 1, you know that there's a practice session, and it was scheduled for Thursday, but basically you can begin at any point now. And for the practice session, I'm just asking that you contact me, and then we can make arrangements as to how you'd like to proceed. If you just wanted to have an email dialogue with me, talking a little bit about what you're planning on writing your speech about, that's fine. If you wanted to contact me so that we could set up a meeting, let's say via Zoom, we can do that. If you wanted to contact me so that we could set up a telephone conversation, we can do that as well. If it turns out that you actually wanted to deliver the speech in its entirety to me and get feedback, you can do that. Or you can just send me your outline and get some feedback on that. So in other words, you can think of me as a kind of tutor, that this practice session is utilizing me in whatever way is in your best interest. And I do want to touch base with each of you, so definitely you should be contacting me. But outside of that, it's pretty much up to you as to how little or how much contact we have and what kind of vehicle we use for that particular contact for speech number 1. So do contact me at any point now about speech number 1. And you can see that you are also being asked to upload your speech. And there are directions from IT on how to go about uploading that particular speech. And those directions are in the notes below, section 2. About clicking onto studio@youtube.com is what they recommend. This is how I actually upload the class videos. And click the blue upload button on the dashboard and basically just follow the directions. You drag and drop your MP4 file or click select files to open a file picker window. On the details window, add a description as the video is being uploaded. When you click next, you'll be prompted to identify if the video is intended for children. And most users skip adding any elements, and then on the visibility tab, set the visibility to unlisted and then click save. Though certainly there are other ways that you can go about recording your speech and uploading it, but this is probably the simplest way. But again, of course, if you've got questions, feel free to contact me and or IT. So in terms of what I wanted to talk about today, that speech rating sheet that I had indicated is in the syllabus and other documents folder. And basically I'll be using it for your first speech as a kind of template. After that, I don't even bother using that template. I just take notes on my own. But if you are looking at that document in the syllabus and other documents folder, you'll see that it's divided up into 2 sections, and the first happens to be on content and the second happens to be on delivery. And thus far we've been talking about content. Things like your introduction. Do you have an attention getter? Which could be just as simple as saying hello to your audience. And then is there a transition to some kind of a preview statement or a thesis? And then your body or your discussion section, and this is where you are going to have your evidence and details. Is there a clear pattern? Are the main points stated? Are the points developed? And you'll notice that there's a ranking scale here from none to needs improvement to good to excellent. And voice mannerisms, you're using ums, ahs, things of that nature. And then finally, well-chosen words. Do your words basically give the audience a sense of what specifically it is that you're trying to say without, of course, trying to read your speech or memorize your speech. You want to have key words and ideas in your speaking outline that basically prompt you, and then you can fill in the rest with unscripted material. So you want to have a certain level of conversationality when you are delivering your speech. So it's much more informal. than it would be if you were actually writing. So you should keep that in mind as well. And I know the temptation is going to be that when you submit your speaking outline to me, you will submit in a speaking outline that's different than the outline you actually used for delivering the speech. Do submit in the outline that you use for delivering the speech, because I want to be able to give you feedback on that, so that when you are in other positions when you're delivering a speech, hopefully you'll be able to construct an outline that is to your benefit. So again, key words and phrases, though I've certainly had students write out a speech and then continue to reduce it until they get key words and phrases so that they can deliver that to the audience. The outline is going to be due on the same date and time as the speech is going to be due, and I'm just going to ask you to send the outline to me via email, via PDF, much like you did with your quizzes. And then, of course, you'll be uploading your speech onto our Moodle site. And then ultimately, I will have all of you review all of your classmates' speeches and then send me some private feedback about strengths and weaknesses of those speeches, so that I can compile all of that information and share all of that with you. And while you'll get that feedback, you'll also get my personal feedback privately, which is part of this speaking outline. You'll notice that the speaking outline ends in terms of the conclusion, at least for the content section. It's summary and restatement, and a way of basically giving closure to the audience and saying goodbye. And then finally, the delivery piece, that's the second part of his speech, and that is going to be something that we are going to be focusing on today. Things like eye contact, body movement, vocal quality, articulation. In other words, are you mumbling? Enthusiasm, and you want to appear enthusiastic even if you aren't enthusiastic. A lot of public speaking is about acting. It's about convincing the audience. So you will see that our first chapter that I'd assigned for today, Delivering Speeches, talks about different kinds of speeches that you might deliver. And what we are delivering in this class is the extemporaneous speech. It's prepared in advance and it's delivered with a speaking outline, but it isn't read and it isn't memorized. Now, you could have the impromptu speech. This is a spur-of-the-moment speech that's done without any prior preparation. Usually it's a surprise for the speaker. Perhaps they've been given an award, for instance. I always suggest that you keep things short and simple, get in and out as soon as possible, so that there isn't a likelihood that you can ramble and make errors. There also is the manuscript speech, where you can read from a manuscript or a teleprompter. This is oftentimes done in academic conferences where you read from a manuscript. Or if you're reading from a teleprompter, it could be something like a news broadcast, where the information has to be very precise, right down to the second. I personally have never used a teleprompter, but I can tell you that that also is a skill. And you'll notice that in the notes below, under the third section, Delivering Speeches, I'm asking you to watch a brief film clip of a teleprompter fail. And this is about a very well-renowned director, Michael Bay, and you'll see that he was introducing some of his new movie techniques, and what ended up happening was the teleprompter failed, and let's just say he didn't handle it very well. Again, I ask you to watch the clip. It's only a couple of minutes long, and you can see that even though he was well-versed in the content, he was relying so much on the teleprompter that he was unable to recover his thoughts and present in front of the audience effectively and efficiently. So even with the teleprompter, that doesn't necessarily guarantee that you won't have difficulties. There also is the memorized speech. Usually it's very brief and very formal. Think about something like a toast at a wedding. Again, it has to be something that's very brief. So certainly you wouldn't be memorizing or trying to memorize any of our speeches. They're much too long, and you certainly don't want to get into a situation where you begin to forget things in terms of memorizing. Your voice, as I had indicated, you want to be conversational, which means you want to vary things like your volume, sometimes low, sometimes louder, your speed. And this is one of my areas of challenge, because I tend to speak very quickly. So sometimes just slowing down or even just pausing can be very effective for dramatic effect. And inflections. Yeah, the idea of which words do you stress and which words do you not stress. And all of those things, play a role ultimately and how engaged an audience is going to be in the information that you happen to be presenting. So you don't want to speak in a monotone. You also want to enunciate clearly. Again, you want to make sure that you are clearly forming words and you are pausing for effect occasionally. There is something called proxemics. It's the use of space. This becomes particularly important when you are delivering a speech live because you get to think about things like seating arrangements and so forth. But even still, when you're being recorded, you want to think about how distant the camera is from you. Again, we want to have good visibility of at least your face. And this is because of affect display. In other words, facial expressions, which is usually how we read an individual. Less so about what they say and more so about how they say it. And I believe I shared with you the Nixon-Kennedy debates that occurred where Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy were debating one another, and approximately half of the audience listened to the debate on the radio and approximately the other half on television. And those who saw the debate on television declared John Kennedy the winner because he appeared presidential. And those who heard the debate on the radio came to the exact opposite conclusion, that Richard Nixon had won the debate because of the content of his speech. And for better or worse, because of our highly visual culture, we really do rely on visual and audio cues. Things like gestures, which again, you may or may not be able to necessarily capture on screen. But you think about conventional gestures, they are assigned meaning purely by custom. So they don't necessarily have to mean that. A thumbs up does not necessarily have to mean good, but we've come to the conclusion that it would. And keep in mind that different cultures might have different meanings associated with that. So the OK sign can have a very different meaning in other countries. It could be considered vulgar, actually, in some Latin American countries. Then there are descriptive gestures. Those are much more universal, and they describe things like size and shape. So if I were going to talk about something that's this long and this high, for instance. Or you can have an indicator, something that expresses feeling, for instance, slamming the fist on the podium. Think about eye contact. And again, you don't have an audience to look at. If you were looking at an audience, what I suggest you do is that you choose 3 points in the audience, midsection, left and right, so that it looks like you're scanning the room at the very least. You could look at the top of people's heads rather than look in their eyes if you feel uncomfortable. With this situation where you're recording yourself, you're looking at a camera. So basically, the camera is your audience. So you want to make sure that you're maintaining eye contact with the camera, because this is what we are going to see when we play back your particular speech. And culture is oftentimes dependent on many of these variables, which is what Chapter 4 was about. Culture, in the broadest definition, is any group membership. And I guess we could argue as to whether or not 2 people are a group or a pair, but certainly 3 or more people are a group. And because of their group membership, they share certain commonalities: beliefs, values, attitudes, and behaviors. Beliefs, things they think are true or false. Attitudes, which are emotional responses. Values are oftentimes so deeply embedded that they are very difficult to change, and they include things like beliefs and attitudes and behaviors. Behaviors are visible actions. So obviously you want to make sure that you avoid stereotyping, that you're not assuming that everyone in the group is exactly the same, but there probably is some predictive element. So that, for instance, you can predict, for instance, based on a demographic, which are the observable characteristics of an audience, how an audience might behave based on something like, let's say, age, or based on something like gender. And then it's usually, we think about those big cultural groups, ethnicity, religion, political persuasion. But a culture can also be very specific. So it could be based on a hobby or an interest. For better or for worse, GCC is a culture of itself. And I've had students tell me that they've attended other schools and that they're different Not necessarily better or worse, just different. That we have our own behaviors and our own values and our own expectations. Even our class, because we are a group, has a particular culture. And if you've ever been in a course before, you'll know that classes develop personalities, much like individuals have personalities as well. So there's a somewhat of a predictive element there. And when we think about culture, obviously we will have many cultures in our audience. When we talk about multicultural, that's what we mean, many audiences, or many cultures, I should say. And we all belong to hundreds, if not thousands, of cultures. And of course, you can't appeal to all of them. But certainly, you want to try to reflect on who your audience is and try to be audience centered. Adapt to the needs and expectations of the audience, and that includes the needs and expectations of their cultural group. So, one of the things the textbook talks about is what happens if you have a hostile audience. And I doubt that would ever happen in an academic setting. Usually it happens in something like a political setting. In other words, you know when you are going to be walking into that situation. But I think you might have a skeptical audience in an academic setting, particularly when we start getting into speeches that are persuasive. So I don't have necessarily a magic formula, but I do have some suggestions. You can try to establish goodwill, that there's good intent all the way around. Areas of agreement, that yes, there might be a good amount of disagreement in various areas, but at least we can agree about these specific points. Use credible outside sources. Again, that shows that at least you have some credibility because you are credible in your research. We will be talking about this further when we get to the persuasive speech, in particular when you will be required to use outside resources. Be professional. Just the idea that you're prepared is a way to establish goodwill with your audience. Use humor. Though, of course, humor can be culturally based and sometimes it can backfire. What's funny to you or to one group may not necessarily be funny to another. So that's something to consider. And be multi-sided. You know, I talk about the elephant in the room, that sometimes individuals are so intent on proving their particular position that they don't discuss other possible positions. And I know this is tricky because you don't want to lose control of your speech and start talking about the other side too much. You want to have your area of presentation, but at least acknowledging that there are different ways to view an issue oftentimes can give a sense of validation to your audience. Sometimes your audience just wants to be acknowledged. And what I wanted you to do was to watch some sample autobiographical speeches. Now, these are sample speeches that are given by students like yourselves that have been uploaded onto YouTube, so I'm assuming that they are available for public consumption. That's one of the reasons why GCC had recommended that you set your speech to private so that no one can see it outside of you. Now, these particular speeches I selected from these students are in no way affiliated to GCC. I did that very purposefully, so I wanted us to have a certain level of distance. And I thought that watching these autobiographical speeches might give you a sense of how you could proceed with your own autobiographical speech. Now, there's some things that we can't evaluate. So, for instance, we can't necessarily evaluate the length of time of the speech because I don't know if they were given the same parameters that we have to follow with the 5 minutes. That said, we can evaluate things like eye contact, and we can evaluate things like introduction and body and conclusion. So I have 3 sample autobiographical speeches, and you'll see that they're all very different from one another. The first speech that you'll be watching is being presented in the military, and I chose that particular speech because of our conversations about culture and how there's certain behaviors and values and attitudes that you can identify with a particular cultural group that would be perhaps odd in another cultural group. And I think you'll see that in the presentation of this speech that not only do we have a speaker that is not using speaking notes, which is what you usually do when you're presenting a speech, but is in full uniform and the audience members are standing. And of course, that would be something that would be very different from what one would expect, let's say, in an academic setting. But it would be appropriate for that particular situation. And then the second speech the speaker uses a prop. Now, you're not required to use any audio or visuals, but one of the things that we will talk about is how audio and visuals can enhance your speech. You will be required to use an audio or video for your second speech. I didn't want you to have to be worried about that for the first speech, but certainly if you feel compelled to use some sort of audio or visual, you can with the first speech. Remember, that should supplement, not substitute, for you delivering the speech. So again, we wouldn't want something that would obscure your face for a long period of time, for instance. And then we've got the third speech, which is very different from the other two speeches, but it also addresses the idea of culture, and I thought that would be very useful for us to see a different perspective. So 3 different speeches that I wanted you to view, and then that is going to be our attendance question for today, when you would answer on our discussion form, and this would be due on Thursday the 28th by 9 a.m. Though if you need an extension, please let me know. To please list one strength and one weakness from each of the 3 sample autobiographical speeches that I'm asking you to watch. To list one strength and one weakness for each of the autobiographical speeches. And of course, you'll be able to read your classmates' comments and my responses as well. So this will give you a good idea of what we would have discussed in class, because I normally would have shown these 3 speeches in class, and then we would have had a conversation about strengths and weaknesses about each of those speeches. And then what we will do next class is have our quiz. As I had indicated, I do want you to contact me about what it is you're going to be doing for the first speech and how much or how little assistance you would like with that. And then ultimately, we will move into the presentation of our speeches by having you upload your speech onto our Moodle site next week. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. Enjoy. I don't know if that's necessarily the right word, but enjoy the viewing of the 3 autobiographical speeches, and perhaps they will inspire you with the construction of your own speech. Take care. Bye-bye.